All right, let's explore another question that you responded to in your thought primer. The question is it fair if the government were to create a special wealth tax on people like Bill Gates, Elon Musk, these uber wealthy people, and use the money for things like canceling student debt or creating a universal basic income program? Or would such an action be unfair? And you can probably guess that an ethical libertarian is going to look at a proposal like this and say, no, that kind of action would be grossly unfair. And they would justify their claim that it's unfair in a couple of different ways. One is by offering arguments from efficiency. And remember that from the ethical libertarian standpoint, arguments from efficiency assume that what we ultimately are striving to achieve is the greatest good for the greatest number, and that the way that we can do that most efficiently and effectively is by granting each individual as much bodily autonomy, bodily ownership as possible, and allowing them to retain as much of the fruits of their labor as possible. And so an ethical libertarian offering arguments from efficiency might come at this proposal and say, look, this may sound like an easy way to redistribute income in your system, but ultimately, this is going to bring about some costs that are not in the interest of the greater good. They might, for example, say, this might be perceived as a disincentive to take on risky business ventures that have the possibility of a really great reward, right? So they might say, look, would Elon Musk have really started Starlink? Would he have really started Tesla? Would he have really started SpaceX if there weren't the hope of reaping some great benefit in the end, or because of these very, very risky business ventures? And so you might actually disincentivize people in the future from taking these risky ventures that we all, in a way, benefit from when they're successful. So that might be one argument they would make. They might also argue that such a proposal like this might actually have the counterintuitive consequence of removing the wealth from the system that you're trying to acquire out of the system to redistribute. And they might point to some place like California and say, look, California has had these increasingly burdensome tax and regulatory structures over the last decade or so, and one of the things that we've seen in response to that is that a lot of corporations have left the states for other places. Elsewhere in the country or elsewhere in the world. And what ended up happening is that money that California was trying to acquire to redistribute to everybody else in California's system, simply that money just left California's system. And so an ethical libertarian might say a consequence of this kind of wealth tax might be the same thing, that a wealthy person might not just sit around and say, sure, take my money through this wealth tax. They just may simply relocate their wealth to a different system, and then that money's out of our system entirely. Okay, I think though an ethical libertarian is probably going to make more arguments from principle than efficiency in this case. Remember, the arguments from principle are these arguments that have to do with just the principle or the value of freedom and autonomy, and the inherent value of being able to lay rightful claim to the fruits of your labor. And they're going to say something like, hey, this sounds really good and all, make corporations and the uber wealthy pay their fair share, but how is it really fair to take a disproportionate amount of income from one person than you take from another, simply on the basis that one person has more money than the other, right? So they might say, okay, you've got one person who's making $100,000 a year, and you take, say, 25 or 30% of their income in the form of income tax. And you've got this other person who's one of these ultra rich. He or she's making $1 billion a year. And you say, simply because of the fact that they've acquired more wealth, I'm going to take a greater portion of it. I'm going to take 60% of their wealth in taxes. And the ethical libertarian is going to say, I don't think that simply a difference in the amount of accumulated wealth is sufficient justification for treating these two people differently, right? And so now you don't have to agree with those arguments, of course, but I want you to think about where you kind of fall down on this question here. Do you think such a wealth tax would be fair or unfair? And I'd encourage you to reflect back on the way that you responded to the lawnmower scenario that you dealt with in a different question, right? Where you have this person who shows up at your door after you've accumulated a significant amount of wealth, like $50,000 a year in income, and this person comes to you and says, I believe you have more than you need. and I don't have enough for what I need. So I think you're either morally obligated, or perhaps I'm even morally justified. You're morally obligated to give me the money that I'm saying you don't need, that I need, or I'm maybe even morally justified in taking from you the money that I don't think you need. Now, if in this scenario you find yourself saying, well, wait a minute here, the lawn mowing scenario is $50,000, and that doesn't really compare to Bill Gates and Elon Musk. Okay, fair enough. So then the question the libertarian is going to put to us is this. The libertarian is going to say, well, if you think that it's fair to take greater portions of wealth from people who have more of it, how do we determine who has what they need and who has more than they need? And what's the criteria for determining those things? And who gets to do it? And the ethical libertarian is going to kind of put a lot of pressure on us here and say, there's not really a way to do that that's fair, because those who have less are always going to say that those who have more than they need, because they have more than those who have less. So think about how you'd respond to these kind of libertarian arguments, and think about how you might justify any inconsistency in your response to the wealth tax question and the lawnmower company question.